All right, let's jump right in. We're taking a deep dive into the book of Hebrews today.
Specifically, chapters 5 through 7.
You got it, chapters 5 through 7. And, this whole concept of Jesus as our eternal high priest,
It's fascinating, isn't it?
it is. But it can also be a little, well, mysterious.
Yeah, I get that. A lot of folks don't really know what to do with this whole high priest thing.
Exactly. And that's why we're here, right? To break it down, to figure out why it matters, not just as some abstract theological idea.
Right, but for your actual life.
How does this impact me today?
That's a great question.
So maybe we should start by going back to basics. What was the role of a high priest in ancient Israel?
Well, it wasn't just about wearing fancy robes and leading ceremonies,
I figured there was more to it than
Yeah, it was a huge deal. The high priest was like a bridge between humanity and God.
Okay, I like that, a bridge. Because if we think about it, God is often portrayed as this all-powerful, kind of distant being, right?
Yeah.
So the high priest was like the designated ambassador, the one who could approach the king on behalf of the people.
Exactly. And they were responsible for offering sacrifices for sins.
So basically pleading our case before God.
Exactly. They were standing in the gap, asking for forgiveness and reconciliation on behalf of the people.
Okay, so that's the basic setup. But what makes Hebrews so mind-blowing is that it presents Jesus.
Not just as a high priest.
Right, but as the high priest.
And not just any high priest, but one appointed by God in the order of Melchizedek.
Whoa. Okay, now we're getting into some deep biblical waters here. Melchizedek, remind me who that is again and why this order matters so much.
So Melchizedek is this figure who shows up in Genesis and then kind of disappears just as quickly. He's a bit of an enigma.
Yeah, I remember him being kind of mysterious.
But here's the thing. He's described as both a king and a priest.
Ooh, that's unusual, right? Wasn't that pretty rare back then?
Yeah, it was. And to make it even more significant, he actually blesses Abraham.
Whoa, Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation.
That's right. So right from the start, there's this sense that Melchizedek is a pretty big deal. And some scholars see him as a foreshadowing of Jesus.
Okay, so like a prototype, hinting at the kind of priesthood Jesus will establish.
You got it. But the truly wild part about Melchizedek's priesthood is that it's described as eternal.
Eternal. Wow. So unlike the Levitical priests who served in shifts and were bound by their lineage and all that.
Exactly. Melchizedek's priesthood transcends time and genealogy. It's not limited by human constraints.
So unlike those human priests who came and went, Jesus' priesthood is forever.
Forever.
That changes things, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It means that Jesus' sacrifice wasn't just a one-time event that, kind of fades over time.
Right, it's not like it loses its power or anything.
Exactly, because he's our eternal high priest. He's always interceding for us.
Constantly presenting our case before God.
That's right. And the other amazing thing is that, because Jesus lived a human life.
Yeah, he gets it.
He totally gets it. He understands our struggles firsthand.
That is a really powerful thought, that in the midst of our everyday struggles,
Our doubts.
our failures, all of it, we have Jesus, who lived a perfect life, but can still relate to our imperfections.
Mm-hmm.
And he's constantly advocating for us. It makes the whole idea of prayer a lot more personal, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's not just about rattling off a list of requests, it's about having this ongoing conversation with someone who knows us inside and out.
And who is always in our corner, always fighting for us.
Exactly.
So we've got Jesus, this eternal high priest, rooted in this mysterious figure of Melchizedek. But Hebrews doesn't stop there, right? Chapter 6 kind of takes a turn.
It does, doesn't it?
It's like the writer is saying, okay, you've got this incredible high priest on your side. Now it's your turn to step up.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a call to spiritual maturity.
Don't just sit there, grow.
Exactly. Don't settle for the basics.
Yeah.
Move forward. But at the same time, it's also full of reassurance.
It's like that saying, God is faithful even when we're faithless.
That's it. No matter what, he keeps his promises. But yeah, that call to maturity.
It can feel a little daunting sometimes.
It can.
Where do we even begin?
Well, I think Hebrews gives us a pretty powerful example to follow.
Okay, I'm listening.
Abraham, think about it. He waited decades for God to fulfill his promise of a son.
Talk about patience. We get impatient if our Amazon order takes an extra day.
Right. But Abraham, decades of uncertainty, and yet his faith didn't waver.
Wow. So what can we learn from his example?
I think it comes down to trusting God's timing. Even when things feel uncertain or delayed, his promises are worth waiting for.
Even if it takes a lot longer than we'd like.
Exactly. And, that waiting period isn't wasted time.
Oh, I like
It's
that.
a time for growth, for becoming more like him.
Okay, so we're learning to see Jesus as our internal high priest, someone who understands us completely, is constantly interceding for us, and we're being challenged to grow in our faith,
No.
trusting God's promises even when the timeline doesn't make sense. And all of this is tied to this fascinating figure of Melchizedek. I gotta say, this is pretty cool stuff.
It is. And we're just getting started. Chapter 7 really gets to the heart of why this whole Order of Melchizedek thing matters so much.
And how it completely changes our relationship with God.
You got it.
All right, so we're digging deeper into Hebrews, right? Still trying to wrap our heads around this whole Jesus as eternal high priest thing.
In chapter 7 is where it all comes together.
It seems like it. Like, this is where the author's like, okay, let me explain why this Melchizedek connection is such a big deal.
Yeah, it's not just some random biblical trivia.
Right, like, why should I care about this Melchizedek guy?
Because it reframes everything. Our whole understanding of how we relate to God.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So tell me, how does Melchizedek connect to this idea of a new covenant that we hear so much about?
Okay, so think about it. The Old Covenant, right? It was all about laws and rituals.
There's lots of rules to follow.
Yeah. And you had this whole priesthood system based on lineage.
Like who your dad was, right?
Exactly. And they had to offer constant sacrifices.
Sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice.
But Jesus, as the high priest in the order of Melchizedek, he's not bound by any of that.
So it's not about checking off all the boxes anymore.
No. The old system was kind of like a Band-Aid solution.
Like, it pointed towards the need for atonement, but it couldn't really get the job done.
Right. It never fully cleansed us from sin or reconciled us to God.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
But then Jesus comes along, and with his single perfect sacrifice, he does what all those animal sacrifices could never do.
He paid the price once and for all.
Exactly.
It's like those verses in Hebrews that talk about a better sacrifice and a better covenant.
Yeah. It's not just a slight improvement.
Right, like, oh, this covenant's a little bit better than the last one.
It's a complete overhaul,
Yeah.
a total game changer.
Okay, I'm with you. So the old covenant is like trying to climb a mountain with heavy chains on your ankles.
Yes.
And the new covenant, through Jesus, it's like you've been given wings.
That's a great analogy. You're soaring. You're free.
Okay, I love that imagery. But here's the question that keeps popping up for me. If Jesus has already removed all the barriers between us and God, why do we still struggle so much?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why do we still feel so weighed down by guilt and fear? Like, why do we still feel so distant from God sometimes?
And I think it gets to the core of what it means to actually grow spiritually.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's one thing to know these truths in our heads, or to agree that Jesus did all this amazing stuff for us.
Yeah, we can give it a thumbs up.
But it's another thing entirely to let those truths sink into our hearts and actually change how we live.
To really internalize it, right?
Yes. It's about letting it transform us from the inside out.
So why is that so hard?
Well, I think we get stuck in these old patterns of thinking.
Like those default settings in our brains.
Exactly. Like we're not good enough. We have to earn God's favor. We need to carry the weight of our past mistakes.
We're still trying to climb that mountain with chains on our ankles.
You got it. And sometimes even our religious traditions can unintentionally reinforce those old patterns.
How so?
We can get so focused on doing all the right things, following all the rules,
Checking off the boxes.
that we miss the heart of what Jesus is offering. Rest, acceptance, a relationship with God that's based on grace, not performance.
It's like we're so used to carrying this heavy backpack full of all our anxieties and to-do lists.
I love that, the backpack.
We forget we've been offered a lighter load.
We think we need all that stuff, like it defines us or protects us somehow.
But what if it's actually weighing us down?
What if that freedom and closeness that we long for,
Yeah, that deep connection with God.
it comes from setting down the backpack and trusting that we don't have to carry it all anymore?
Just let it go.
Yes, that's the whole point of the gospel, isn't it? To trade our heavy burdens for the lightness and joy of walking with Jesus.
To stop trying to control everything and just surrender.
To the one who loves us without any strings attached and holds everything together.
Wow. Okay, I love all that. But how do we actually do that? How do we make that shift?
From head knowledge to heart transformation.
Yeah, from carrying the weight of the world to embracing the freedom that Jesus offers.
Well, I think it starts by taking a good hard look at those barriers we've built up.
Okay, like what are the things that keep us from just running to God with open arms?
Guilt, shame, fear of judgment, feeling unworthy.
Yeah, I think we've all been there at some point.
We've all got our own personal barriers.
It's like we're trying to get to God through this complicated maze.
When Jesus already opened the door wide open.
Yeah, he's like, just come on in. What are you waiting for?
Exactly. And his sacrifice removes all those barriers.
So we don't have to earn our way in.
No. It's already been done.
That's crazy. It feels almost too good to be true.
It is radical. It goes against everything our culture tells us.
Like you got to earn it. You got to be perfect.
Right. But that's the whole point of grace.
It's a free gift.
Exactly. And when we really grasp that, when it sinks down deep into our souls,
What happens?
it changes everything. We can come to God with boldness.
Without hiding or pretending or trying to be someone we're not.
Exactly. Because we know we're loved and accepted, not because of anything we've done, but because of what Jesus has done.
That is incredibly freeing.
It is. It takes all the pressure off.
You don't have to be perfect. You just have to accept the gift.
That's it. But let's be honest, it's not always easy to let go of those burdens, is it?
It's not, is it? Like, it sounds so good when we talk about it.
Right, surrendering those burdens, embracing freedom.
But then real life hits, and we're back to our old ways.
Yeah, old habits die hard, right?
They do. So what can we do? Like, how do we actually make this a reality in our everyday lives?
Well, I think it requires intentionality. It's not going to happen by accident.
Okay, so we can't just sit back and hope for the best.
Nope. We got to be proactive. We need to create habits that keep us connected to God.
Habits? Like, what kind of habits?
Well, one of the most powerful is simply spending time with God.
That sounds pretty basic.
It is. But we make it so complicated sometimes.
How so?
We turn it into this big to-do list.
Yeah, like, okay, I gotta read my Bible, I gotta pray for this, I gotta pray for that.
And we forget to actually connect.
To just be with God.
Exactly. It shouldn't feel like an obligation.
Or like another item on our to-do list that we gotta check off.
Right. It should be about wanting to know Him more deeply, wanting to experience His presence.
So it's about creating space in our lives to just be with God.
Yes.
Yes.
To soak it all in, to let His words sink in, to listen.
Not just talk at Him.
Exactly. And that's going to look different for everyone.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Some people find quiet time helpful.
Yeah, like meditation.
Others connect with God through nature.
Or music. Or even art.
Absolutely. The key is to find what works for you.
What helps you tune in to God's voice?
And to experience His love in a real, tangible way.
Not just some abstract idea.
Right, but something you can feel, something that changes you.
And I imagine that as we spend more time with God, we start to see things differently.
Oh, absolutely. The world starts to look different.
Like those old patterns of thinking, the anxieties, the fears.
Start to lose their grip.
They don't have the same power over us anymore.
Because we're seeing things through God's lens now.
Through His lens of love and grace.
Exactly. And we realize we're not alone.
We have this incredible high priest who understands everything we're going through.
And who's always fighting for us.
It's like that backpack analogy.
I was hoping you'd bring that back.
As we spend time with God, as we let His truth sink in, we realize we don't need all that stuff anymore.
You don't.
All those fears, all those insecurities, all that baggage.
We can set it down.
And just walk with Jesus unburdened.
Free. It's a process, for sure. It doesn't happen overnight.
It's not a magic formula.
No. But as we keep coming back to God, as we keep surrendering and embracing His grace,
We'll become more and more like the people He created us to be.
yes, free, joyful, fully alive.
Man, that is a beautiful picture. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Hebrews,
Specifically, chapters 5 through 7.
right, these chapters focusing on Jesus as our eternal high priest.
Powerful stuff.
It really is. I'm leaving with this renewed sense and hope.
Me too. It's
Yeah.
not just about understanding theology,
It's about experiencing transformation.
living it out.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next